So Todd and I have been talking, I feel like this has been a discussion for a while just because of some articles that came out and some friends of ours that are experiencing this. But what we know now, if everybody didn't know this already, is when it comes to ADHD, which stands for attention deficit and hyperactive. Wait a second. Just hold on. Just hold that thought.
You want me to Google ADHD?
No. I just want to make, because there has been some, because of the definition there. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Thank you. Yeah. Sometimes I add in inattention, and that's really just part of the diagnosis. Okay. So ADHD, it looks different in women and men. And the reason why this is so interesting is because if you didn't know this, a lot of our drugs and a lot of our like diagnoses are not based on women. They're mostly based on men. Okay. What that means is that women were not included in a lot of research when it came to not just ADHD, but other diagnoses, because they couldn't be depended on.
Well, there's more variables.
In
a women's body cycle, all that stuff.
Yeah. A lot of times they've been neglected from research because, and this is an unsubstantiated belief. Like, this isn't necessarily true. I'm having a hard time saying words. That our cycle would somehow cause variability in the results. Mm-hmm. So there's also, this is the other one that kind of shocked me. Women are twice as likely to suffer adverse reactions to drugs, which means that like 80% of drugs are withdrawn from the marketplace. So people can't like promote them and they don't get, FDA approval. So they start pulling women out of the actual study to get the drugs approved. But do you see how that makes no sense? Basically, then you're just creating drugs for men, because women are having side effects from these drugs. And they're like, yeah, but we want to get it out there. Yeah. So we don't want to count you.
So in other words, they'll say, hey, this drug's good to go. It'll impact a man in a certain way, and it'll impact a woman.
Well, they're able to go through the whole scientific process, do the research on it, and get the results they need to push it through. Yeah. But when they would have women in the study and women would say, hey, I'm having an adverse reaction here, or I'm having this experience here, they'd say, rather than like figure out how to have that not happen, we're just going to pull you from the study. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So then the belief is that like, if we are studying men when it comes to ADHD or cardiovascular or whatever, our DNA is close enough that we're going to have the exact same experience, if it be a drug or a diagnosis. But that's not true. And now there's been obviously some legislation. There's been some, organizations, groups, like some advocacy and some, activism around getting women involved in research. But I think the stat is still really low. I thought I had written it down, but it's not happening the way that we thought it would. It's too slow.
Yeah.
Let's just say that. Like, we've started changing it, but it's too slow. So anyway, what's been happening is that ADHD is now being diagnosed more in women. Okay. So this is happening because basically this is a Gen X thing, I have to be honest with you, is that there are so many women in my age group who are now being diagnosed because as kids, they weren't thought of having an attention issue. They were just thought of as being like flaky or flighty or absent mind. How many girls did we call ditzy? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that wasn't the only symptom, but it was like there was a passivity to it, like, oh, this doesn't affect them. And then what's unfortunate is that with ADHD, if it's undiagnosed, a lot of times what really becomes the presenting feature is anxiety. And so then we diagnose a lot of women with anxiety because that becomes the thing they experience because of the untreated ADHD. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we're just kind of now figuring this out. And I just know like the stat has gone up tremendously as far as like the amount of kids that are diagnosed with ADHD, boys versus girls. It's like significant difference, like 70% of boys and like 3% of girls. But then as we get older, the stat starts to get closer because women can now because we're involving women in research and we're actually researching women's experience with ADHD, we see something different.
Well, and I think I'd like to jump in just about my experience. I've been in the professional world for 30 years and have experienced all different types of people. And when I think of ADHD, I think of like some friends of mine, some colleagues of mine, easily distracted. Like they can't sit in a meeting for more than 10 minutes before they stand up or before they, bring another element of the kind. Like they just can't sit still. And I used to, and probably still do sometimes, judge these people. I'm like, will you just sit down? I say it in my head, will you just sit down so we can finish this, so we can move on to the next thing? And it has happened a lot. And we were just talking before we pressed record this morning, how it's important, as much as we don't like labeling people or introducing different frameworks. If I know somebody is dealing with, thank you, with ADHD, whether they know it or don't know it, or whether I think it or it's true or not, it helps me have a little more empathy and compassion for that person. And there's a few people in my life that I'm super close to, work colleagues, some friends, and I'm now understanding them a little bit better because, my world is, can't everybody just be like me, which is sit down and
show up on time, be focused,
do all that other stuff. And that doesn't mean everybody gets off the hook for everything. But if we can understand each other a little bit better, if I can understand these people in my life a little bit better, I can more easily have empathy and compassion. And like, maybe I run a meeting differently. Like, okay, we've been sitting here for 20 minutes. It's now time for us to stand up, take a breath, go outside, look at nature, and then let's come back in 2 minutes or something like that. So that's why I wanted to bring up this topic, because we've done 750 or so of these podcasts, and I don't think we've ever talked about this.
Well, so let's talk about the diagnosis itself so people know what we're talking about. So there's 3 types of diagnosis when it comes to ADHD. So inattentive type is the first one. So that's like, typical forgetfulness, lack of attention to detail, inability to complete tasks, being easily sidetracked. And adults and girls are more likely to be diagnosed with this inattentive type than boys. Okay. I'm not saying it's not a part of boys' experience, because I'll get to that in a second, but girls and, adults. Hyperactivity, impulsive type. Symptoms include feeling restless, fidgety, can take the form of being overly talkative, described as someone who's always in motion or constantly busy. Boys are more likely to be diagnosed with this, especially when they're young. Like I will say, I used to diagnose kids all the time because I worked at a children's hospital here in Chicago, and I could almost tell. I'd been there for a few years, and I would meet a boy, and even before asking him questions, just by his demeanor, you could tell. Now, I don't mean that I didn't ask the questions, but there was like even a way they looked, even a way their eyes would, dart around. Like you would kind of be like, wow, there's some, obvious hyperactivity. And then of course there's combined type, which includes both inattentive and hyperactive impulsive traits. And they can be mild to severe. Like, again, like everything, it's, it's a bit of a spectrum. It's not that everybody looks exactly the same. But those are the 3 types.
So inattentive, hyperactive, and then a hybrid. Is that what you said?
Hyperactive, impulsive.
Okay.
So, HI. And then the last one is combined, the 2, where somebody is inattentive and they're hyperactive. Okay. And so in women, inattentive is the most common type, which, makes sense. And what we now understand, and we'll dig deeper into these specifics, but is that men and boys, when they have issues with attention, they tend to project it outwards, similar to emotions, right? Like we've often talked about depression, how sometimes in men it shows up as violence and anger, and as women it shows up as depression. It's the same way with, ADHD. Like a lot of men, you see it on the outside. You see their, hyperactivity, you see they're talking a mile a minute. A lot of women turn it internally, and they're very hard on themselves about being forgetful or forgetting to say something or saying something that, or not remembering something or being late, not being on time. And they're very like self-depreciating. And it all kind of, and that's why it can end up showing up as anxiety, because instead of dealing with, oh, my brain actually processes things differently, it's what's wrong with me. And so, these are this understanding of how it's going to look in a woman. And again, I want to, we have to like cover all these pieces. There are women who also show the hyperactivity impulsive part
and
too.
men the other way.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just what is the most typical. The fidgetiness. I have friends who need to move, not just their bodies, but their fingers. They need to have something in their hand. They need to be doing something while they talk. And that is, and I'll say the other thing that I've noticed in the women that I know that now know they have ADHD is they were able to, because they weren't diagnosed as kids or we didn't have this language, they were able to come up with really good skills to counteract the challenge. Okay, what do I mean by that? They were able to become good list makers. They were able to become really good at writing things down and remembering, giving themselves reminders.